Hey everyone, my name is Matt McCool with MotionVFX, and did you know there are 235 nodes built into Fusion? 317 if you count the Resolve effects. That's a lot of nodes. I can understand why it can be overwhelming to know kind of where to start inside Fusion. So today I want to put 5 nodes on your radar that I find to be extremely useful in a wide range of situations, both for visual effects compositing as well as some motion graphics techniques. So kicking off this list, let's talk about the Erode Dilate. This is a fairly simple filter that just expands or contracts your image. In this case, I got a guy standing in front of a green screen and he's wearing a green tie for some reason. I don't know why they didn't do a blue screen or a different color tie, but this kind of happens often. Maybe you have a label on a product or something reflecting, and when you try to key out the background using the delta keyer, for example, here you can see it's also keying out the tie because they're the same color. There's nothing we can really do to bring it back. We could add a polygon to the mask input and draw a mask around like this and invert the mask. And this will work, but if he's moving around a lot or if it's like an hour-long take, you know, that's a lot of work to have to track a mask like this. So instead of that, in this case, what we could do is hit Shift Spacebar again, and I'm going to add an Erode Dilate. And over here in the inspector, you can see we have an amount slider. If we go this way, it will dilate. If we go this way, it will erode. And we also have 4 different filters. The box will kind of give you this blocky erode effect. And then you have linear and Gaussian, which are pretty similar. Both of them are a little bit softer. And then you have circle. And in this case, I think I am actually going to pick circle because our subject has sort of some round edges. But if you're doing this on a product, you might have better luck with the box. So what I want to do is dilate this until this gap is completely filled up. And you can see here it stops at 0.01, but you can always type in a larger amount like 0.02. And we're just going to fill this in. If we hit A, we can look at the alpha channel and we can see it a little bit better. So yeah, I'm just going to make sure that is completely filled. And then what I'm going to do is copy that erode and then paste another one right after it. But this time in the amount, I'm just going to add a minus sign to go in the opposite direction by that same value. So if we look at this compared to the delta keyer by itself, the overall shape should be exactly the same, except we have filled in this hole where the tie is. Of course, we don't want this to look like this, but we can use this shape as a matte to apply over our original footage. So I'm just going to select all 3 of these nodes and move them up a little. And let's grab the matte control node right here and connect our media into the background, and then using the right click, I can drag my output from that last erode into the garbage matte. Let's view that matte control, and it's doing the opposite of what we want, but over here we can go down to matte control and hit invert. And now you can see we brought back the tie and still keyed away the background. We didn't have to mask anything, track anything, do any sort of manual rotoscoping, nothing like that. So let me push this a little bit further and show you another use of the Erode tool. So I'm going to grab a background node and let's actually pipe in the final output into our background right here. Now this will just create a background that has the same shape as our character here. And if we actually merge our footage after the background, we won't really see the background because they're the exact same shape, but we could also add the Erode Dilate right after the background node. And we can just dilate this a little bit. And now we've got an outline around our subject here. And maybe we'll try circle for this one. And we can always go to the background, you know, make it whatever color we want. And that's a super easy way to simply just add kind of an outline around a character using the Erode Dilate. And actually a lot of nodes like the delta keyer, the ultra keyer, the clean plate node, a lot of the keying nodes will have an Erode Dilate slider inside of them, but it's also nice knowing that you can use the Erode Dilate tool just by itself when you need to do something simple with a mask or some text. So speaking of masking, our next node that I want to look at is the Bitmap node. Now this is a really useful node and it kind of works in companion to other nodes. It doesn't really do much on its own, but essentially what it does is it derives a mask from various parts of your image. So let's say, for example, I have some text like this, it's 2 different colors, and I want to add a glow to it. So I can add a soft glow, for example, and of course this will just glow everywhere in the image. And there is this threshold slider. I can kind of try to limit the image it wants to glow, but it doesn't offer that much control. And so we can, limit this with a mask. And if we tried to plug in our text into the mask input like that, we can limit where the glow happens. And let's say, for example, I just want the blue areas to glow. I could even go over here to the settings tab and change this channel right here to blue. And this is sort of doing what I'm asking it to do. It is creating that glow only where there are blue pixels. But as you can see, if I try to increase the glow size, it won't extend beyond where there are blue pixels, because the blue effect mask really just limits where the node affects the image. And anywhere outside of that zone, it will just do absolutely nothing. So to do that, we need to actually use this glow mask. But if you look, you can't actually input a normal 2D image into the glow mask. You only have the effect mask. So this is where the bitmap comes in. So this will actually let you go into either the glow mask or the effect mask. In this case, I want to input something into the glow mask, and then let's pipe our render node into the bitmap, and let's just view the bitmap by itself. Now you can see it just creates a black and white mask, and under the channel right here, we do have a few different options. So if we try red, for example, we can try to clamp out some of those pixels and just kind of select the bevel like this. And now if we look at the soft glow, you can see we're only creating this glow where there are kind of this yellow orangish color. We can even invert the bitmap to just glow along the blue channel right there. Now you can see if we increase the glow mask, we are allowed to extend beyond the area that we're masking without affecting these red or yellow orange pixels. See, if we compare this, we aren't affecting any of this because, again, we're using this bitmap node to select what area we want the glow mask to originate the glow from. So the bitmap node is super handy for all kinds of masking techniques. You can even serialize multiple bitmaps together and kind of choose how they interact with each other and get some really advanced masking. It's probably going to make another appearance later in this video, but for now, let's go ahead and move on to the next node on the list, which is the VariBlur. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the blur node, which is right here on the toolbar. If we add this, it does basically what it sounds like. It will just blur your image like this. But let's say you only wanted to blur a certain part of your image. So you could take a rectangle mask, for example, and feed this into the mask input. We could adjust the location of this rectangle, and that will adjust what gets blurred. But if we increase the soft edge, this will basically feather the edges of the rectangle, then you're going to get this kind of effect where you're blending the sharp version of the image with the blurred image, and in between you're just getting kind of like an opacity blend. It's not very clean, it doesn't look very professional. I don't think it looks as nice as using the VariBlur. So the VariBlur actually has 3 inputs instead of just the 2. And this third one right here is the blur image input. So what this does is if you feed something like a mask into it, this will take those in-between values and actually blur to a lesser amount. Now with this example, you can see we're getting this harsh edge. This happens with images that have an abnormal alpha channel like text. So a quick fix for this, if you're working with text, what you can do is go over here to the shading tab and just enable any of these elements. It doesn't really matter which one, and just switch this to border fill and then make it completely transparent. Now I'm still seeing a little bit of a harsh edge right over here, so I'll just increase the horizontal and the vertical as well. Now this just gives the VariBlur an idea of how big this picture is. So it'll continue to blur even though there's no pixel here. So it doesn't change the look of the text itself. If we toggle that last element on and off, it doesn't look any different, but it does give the VariBlur a bigger image to blur. So if we look at this, we can kind of see the difference between the normal blur. These in-between values, remember, because I have the soft edge cranked up like that, it's actually blurring with a gradual shift. So it looks a lot more realistic, a lot more professional. Now this is a very simple example, but if we come down here, you can see I've got some footage with this graphic right here, and it's really hard to read. So what I've done here is I've added a brightness contrast to take down the gain a little bit, and then also blurred the image. But this time I'm using just a gradient like this, and we are using that to mask out the brightness contrast and the blur. We can kind of adjust that fall off with these on-screen controls. But just like the text example, it doesn't look very realistic. If we kind of zoom in here, these in-between values, we're kind of seeing a sharp and a blurred version of the picture being overlaid on top of each other. And it looks kind of like an 80s sitcom, you know, doesn't look great. So let's see how the VariBlur compares. So I'm just gonna add a VariBlur, and let's just turn off the blur node, and I'm gonna feed this background into the blur input like that. And then let's just increase the blur size. And now you can see a much better result. And we can adjust this fall off, and notice how this has a lot more realistic shift in these in-between values. If we compare that with the normal blur, you can see what I mean. This regular blur, again, looks very cheesy. This one looks realistic. And another thing about the VariBlur is you have 3 different methods. Defocus will kind of emulate sort of like a lens blur, a little bit more like a lens blur. And so if you're after kind of realism, the VariBlur is going to give you those kinds of options. Now, one more example. Here you can see I've got a shot, and I've fed this into a depth map. This is only available in the studio version of DaVinci Resolve. And basically what this does is it will kind of emulate a depth map. This is just a black and white image, which again, we can feed into a VariBlur. And notice when I adjust the target depth, it looks like we're kind of adjusting the lens after the fact. And again, these in-between values, like look at these shelves, how they gradually become blurrier and blurrier as they get further from the camera, right? If we compare that to the regular blur, we don't get that at all. We just kind of get almost like a filter was on the lens or something like that. So again, the VariBlur node is very nice for things like this. I will say it's a little bit more resource intense than the normal blur. So if you don't absolutely need this perfect, realistic, natural fall off, then sometimes you can get away with a regular blur. But if you're ever like, man, I really hate how this looks, try the VariBlur. It will probably look a lot better. All right, so the next node I want to take a look at is called the Planar Tracker, which is one of 4 kinds of trackers inside of Fusion. But the Planar Tracker is specifically good for replacing screens or replacing the sky or even object removals, things like that. Okay, so let's say I want to replace the iPad screen here and put this picture of a fish. Now, because the screen here is solid green, what we could do is add a delta keyer after the iPad shot. And I'm going to use the eyedropper here just to sample a little bit of that green color. And maybe we could even go into the matte control settings here and maybe erode that a little bit, something like that. Now you can see the reflection still shows through, and that's actually okay because when we merge this over the shot with our fish and connect this out to media out, you can see the reflection actually looks pretty realistic. And the only thing that doesn't look realistic is the motion, of course, because we pretty much just have a hole punched through our iPad shot revealing the fish beneath. So here's where I would use the Planar Tracker to stick our picture of the fish onto the screen. So I'm going to click in the empty space up here and bring in a Planar Tracker, and I'm just going to connect the iPad shot into our Planar Tracker. Let's throw this over here in this viewer. Now the Planar Tracker works by basically drawing a box around an area that you want to track. In this case, because this is solid green, I want to be really careful and not put these points, directly inside the green portion here, because there's probably not going to be enough contrast for these points to detect the motion. So I typically like to go right outside of a screen like this. And I'm just going to draw a box here, kind of make sure that it looks like it is lined up with that screen. Okay, and then you want to come over here and hit set, and this will just set the reference time to the frame number that you use to draw the plane here. And there are 2 different trackers. You have the regular point and then you have hybrid point area. I typically try the regular point first because it is a little bit quicker. It works by analyzing the individual points here, so it's not always the most accurate. So let's go ahead and try this first. So I'm going to click the track to end button right here, and right away I can see it's already slipping. So let's go ahead and stop that. And this time I'm going to try the hybrid point area, and let's hit track to end. And I can already tell this is doing a much better job. And then let's hit go again and then go in the reverse. Cool, so that looks like a pretty solid track there. And now at this point, we can go ahead and click the Create Planar Transform button. This will give us a planar transform, which is just a regular transform node that has the tracking data from this tracker. So what I can do now is hold Shift and drop this planar tracker right after the shot with our iPad on the way over to the merge. And now you can see our fish is actually stuck to the screen. And we could even add a transform node right before the planar transform and fit this a little bit better into that screen. And there you go. There's a pretty simple screen replacement using the planar tracker. And we even have some realistic reflections happening on our iPad screen there. So yeah, that was just a really brief overview of the Planar Tracker node. It can be used for a lot more than just replacing screens like this. You can also use it to remove objects or composite new ones into a scene where there's like some 3D camera perspective. So super useful node. It was hard to exclude it on a list like this. Now, moving on to the last node on this list, this one's probably even more popular, but I would argue it's the most useful, versatile, and fun to use node in all of Fusion. This is the fast noise node. So I'm sure you've heard about the fast noise node. This is the only node on this list that is available right here on the default Fusion toolbar. But just in case you're unfamiliar, the fast noise node is just a generator that creates this cloud-like texture. So it's useful for fog and smoke, various kinds of textures like that. Let me just quickly kind of run through some of these settings. So if you increase the seethe rate, you can start to see how it's a little bit animated. You can increase that rate if you want a really fast animation. You can also increase the scale as well as the detail. You can even unlock the scale and type in really large amounts like 100. Now we have like this really cool silky kind of vertical streak pattern. And this is just what's available here on the noise panel. Things get really interesting when you hop into the color panel. So from here, you can adjust the two different colors. So for example, I could go from like this black to maybe like a red. And so you can kind of see the potential with creating backgrounds, motion graphics, things like that. But things get even more interesting when you switch to the gradient type. Now, with the gradient, you actually have more than just the two colors. So the way this works is you have this little gradient bar right here, and you can click on each individual triangle here and adjust their colors. So from here, this is pretty much identical to the two color option. But what's cool is you can also click in the middle and add additional colors. And you can even switch the gradient type. By default, it's set to unidirectional. This will just create the same texture across the whole canvas. But if you switch this to linear, then this will give you this little control bar right here where you can adjust the start point and the end point. So you can really kind of see how you can get a lot of different types of textures just using the gradient. So I find myself reaching for fast noise anytime I need to introduce some chaos or some randomness. It's also really great for kind of revealing or creating like a interesting mask. So let me show you something I have going on down here. So I just have some really simple text. It's just some white text scaling down like that. And I've got a drop shadow applied to it. And then right over here, I just have a red background with a little gradient background, and I am merging those two together using the atop operator. And what I could do is go into my text, into the shading tab right here, and I can switch the type to image, and this will give me this little white input. And then if I connect my background into that white input, then our text will kind of get that same color like this. And now let me try to merge my shadow over my background. And here's what we have now. And then maybe we can add a little bit of a vignette. So I'm just gonna add a brightness contrast and take the gain down a little bit like this, and then add an ellipse mask. And let's invert that and like maybe stretch it out like this and increase our soft edge. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now let's say I wanted to kind of reveal this text in an interesting way. So an easy way to do that again is to use this fast noise. So I'm gonna grab one of these and connect it into the mask input just like that. And right away we can kind of see this cool smoky pattern that masks our text here. Now what I wanna do is actually go into the color tab and switch this to a linear gradient. And I want the starting color to be completely white and the end is going to be completely transparent like that. And let's just bring these pretty close together, kind of like this, maybe even at an angle. And let me actually bring in a second viewer just so you can see how our fast noise looks so that you can understand how it's being affected on our text. So if I roll back this offset dial, you can see that we can sort of reveal our text in this really kind of randomized way. Now I'm gonna go back to the noise for a second, and let's just increase that contrast, like maybe 10, and maybe add a little bit more detail. I think the scale looks pretty good like that. And so what I'm gonna do here is go to the very beginning of the timeline, and I'm just gonna roll back this offset until our text is completely gone. And I'm just gonna add a keyframe, and let's go to frame, maybe like frame 100. And I'm just gonna crank up the offset dial until our text is completely filled in like that. And here's what this looks like so far. And maybe I'll switch back to the single viewer for this. So that's already looking pretty good. Now, one node that works really well in combination with the fast noise is the displace node. So I'm gonna add the displace after our text, and we can feed the fast noise into the green input of that displace. And with the displace node, we can switch to the X and Y, and look what happens when I adjust the X refraction there. We can kind of use that fast noise pattern to displace our text. So it kind of shifts into place as it's being revealed by that fast noise texture. Maybe we can also add a little bit of Y, so it kind of floats down from the top. So that's looking pretty good already. Now let's go a little bit further with this. So I'm gonna bring back our old friend, the bitmap, and I'm gonna connect the displace into the yellow input of the bitmap. And let's just copy and paste that one again. And we're also going to feed this into this second bitmap. So we've got two bitmaps masking each other. Now, whenever you add a second bitmap in sequence, then it adds this new paint mode option right here. Similar to whenever you have a sequence of polygons or any other kind of mask. So what I'm gonna do here is switch this to multiply, and let's actually view this so we can see what it's doing. Let's look at our first bitmap here and invert it. And then using the center controls, I can just slightly, kind of offset this a little bit to create this really cool highlight edge. Now remember, the bitmap is just creating this black and white mask, right? So what I'm gonna do now is add another fast noise and use this bitmap to mask the fast noise. Now I'm gonna unlock the X and the Y, and let's increase the X maybe to like 50 and crank up the contrast like 10. And then we can even add a little bit of an angle, something like this. And this time I'm gonna add some seethe rate. So now we have kind of this glistening edge effect like that. And let's move down here a bit, and I'm just gonna add a few different soft glows. So in this first one, we're going to create a really tight glow. So I'm gonna reduce the size and the gain, I'm gonna crank it up a little bit, and then we can even change the color to maybe like a kind of a goldish color like that. And I'm gonna copy that soft glow, paste a new one. And in the second one, I'm just gonna crank up the glow size a bit and then crank down the gain. And you can see there's a little problem here. We get this kind of dark edge right here. This is because our fast noise has some values that are above 1.0. And our soft glows are going to take that and do some nasty unwanted things with it. So to mitigate this, what we can do is add a brightness contrast after the fast noise, and I'm just gonna clip the blacks and the whites. That way everything is contained within the normal values there. And let's just add one last soft glow just to be safe, and we're gonna crank up that size even more and lower the gain. So now we kind of have this exponential glow. And then we can take this and merge it after everything we had before. And if we play that back, we get this really cool reveal. And this is just using these two different fast noises. The first one, let's bring in a second viewer to show you again. The first one just, again, reveals that mask. And then the second one creates this little glistening effect around the edges, which we are then adding a whole bunch of glows and then re-merging it back over to create our final effect there. And maybe even we could take this and start to blend the glows down a bit. So I'm gonna keyframe the blend and just reduce it a little bit like that. Pretty cool. And honestly, the fast noise node probably deserves its own video. I mean, it's just so useful. You can do so many different things with it. If you go and watch the Ant-Man and the Wasp title tutorial that we put out a while ago. That tutorial utilized the fast noise node quite a bit to create the abstract background, as well as some kind of light streaks and things like that. So that pretty much wraps it up for me today. I hope you gained some value from this video. If you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, definitely leave a comment down below. And thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.